very much for coming along. Today's workshop is about lowlands and the uplands. The initial idea behind it was there's sometimes, as we've heard at the conference, we talk about the lowland peat, the agricultural peat, some of the uplands, and I wanted to explore and to challenge that distinction, see what's behind it, what's in it, and also there isn't an actual answer to this. This is like getting your opinions, getting your thoughts, getting your views. Challenge things if you want to, agree with things if you want to. There are no rules, there's no right answers or wrong answers. We want to find out what you think. Because I think that upland, lowland distinction, we think, deserves a bit of a brutal round and a bit of a poke. It's not necessarily everything. So to start off with, Ian Dyer, who is Natural England's wetland specialist, is going to give us some introduction. And then we're going to break up into smaller groups, where in groups of about 5 or 6 people, you'll be discussing some of the particular questions relating to the uplands and the lowlands. And we'll do about 15 minutes, I think, per session, and we'll rotate it around. But after Ian has spoken, there will be a moment where we have to put the chairs to the side and a couple of tables into here, so we can have a table to sit around, if that's okay? Does that make sense? Excellent. Ian,
great.
To you.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning, everyone. Like Chris said, I'm Natural England's wetland specialist, so I do peatlands and other wetlands, and mostly in the lowlands, although, you know, last 6 or 7 years going up the hill, getting much more involved in higher altitude peatlands, so that's taller. So, yeah, this is kind of some of my personal reflections, really. I haven't spoken to Chris or knew about it. I'm not saying anything that's right, but it's just some material to get you thinking about what we call things, why we call things, about whether it's justified, whether it helps or hinders. So, stuff that should inform the workshops later. So, upland, lowland. I was going to say, are we bothered, but I just thought, I'll leave it off. So, you know, we like binaries. I think generally in the world we like to be, it's quite a simple approach to things. Oh yeah, it's this or that. And particularly in the world of wetlands and peatlands, which it's got a plethora of different descriptions of quite often the same thing. And very often it's not clear quite what it means, or one person uses it one way, one person uses it another way. So I've just come up with a few here. Yeah, upland and lowland. We like to say, oh yes, upland peaks, lowland peak. I'm a lowland peak person, I'm an upland peak person. Okay. Fen and bog. Although they kind of represent two extremes really of minerotrophy and ontotrophy, there's a lot of stuff in between there. Minerotrophic, ontotrophic. So minerotrophic means fed by water that's been in touch with the soil, come out of groundwater, ontotrophic, rain-fed. You know, there's again complexity there. Geogenous, ombrogenous, that geogenous formed from water that's come out of the ground or surface water, ombrogenous formed from rain-fed conditions. Swamp and fen are very different things, but the same thing. Car and wet woodland. It's a minefield, and we kind of bandy these terms about, and quite often don't necessarily share the same view of what they are. It happens throughout nature conservation and sorts of other things. We talk about improved grassland, for instance, which is somebody else's frame of reference, it's the farmer's frame of reference. Should we, as nature conservationists, we call it improved grassland? We do, but yeah, well. So, does it matter? That's the thing. And what kind of implications does it have for what we do and how we behave? So, these are a few questions. These are the first questions that came to my mind when thinking about this and sort of put this to Chris and Lou. What do we mean when we say upland and lowland peatlands? Is this something that we just do in this country? Is it a global thing? Do they do that in Europe? What do we perceive as the differences between them, apart from being at different altitudes? Are there? And are these perceived differences real? And do we have evidence to support calling them regarding them as different entities. So if there are differences, are they ecological, are they hydrological, or are they more defined by what actually happens on them, who owns them? Or both? And what does that mean for how we as practitioners and scientists deal with them? So when you've been through that, where do these answers take you? Do you kind of change the way you think about things, or just carry on doing the same? Does it matter? Does it affect the outcomes, which is probably the critical thing? Why, how, and why? And is this kind of use, the persistence of these divisions that we have, is it actually helping, or is it hindering? And is it actually preventing us doing the best we can for peatlands as a whole? So, I've posed those questions. I'll just go through a few examples of sort of ways in which I think we see some of the sort of implications of the language that we use and what we call things. I think that kind of this dichotomy between upland peat and lowland peat has become much stronger since peat has become a bigger thing and that government's got interested in it, and it's become very much about carbon, and we've now got those targets. So, upland peat. What do I think when I hear somebody talking about upland peat, or what do I think they're thinking about when they say upland peat? I think they mean knackered blanket farm. That's what a lot of people, when they say upland peat, that's what they picture. That's my opinion. You may think different, and we've talked about it. But this is upland peat. This is a kind of base flush valley mire with common reed growing in it. I say upland, it's over 300 metres. It's got black boggrass growing in it. It is in Scotland, but it's got lots of brown mosses. It's not sphagnum. So if you saw this in Norfolk, this kind of thing grows in Norfolk, 50 metres above sea level. But this is upland peat. West Italian. It's very similar to when you go in Norfolk, at 40, 50 metres above sea level. Here's a big valley mire in Cumbria. It's not an apple blanket bog. I think there's an enormous diversity of peatland types, and I think that kind of reduction to upland and lowland massively underplays that diversity. This is what I think people think about when they talk about lowland peat. We've been seeing a lot of it here. This is the lowland peat IUCN conference in the Fens, where this is actually in Shropshire, but it's the same. It's cropped peat. Cropped, 2 weeks of peat, crop failed because it's wet. And this is what I think lowland peat means to a lot of people. But lowland peat is massively, peat in low altitude, massively diverse. This is in Oxfordshire. Cot Hill Fen, alkaline fen, black bogrush, again very low, common cotton grass, which raises another issue, I think, which I'll just touch on. But it's this kind of people think common cotton grass, it's a bog plant. No, it's not. It's a wetland plant, very wet conditions and low nutrient status, and it's got a very wide tolerance of pH. What else have we got? This is New Forest, Bog, gorgeous site. So it's a valley mire system. This is lowland peat. But you don't get any. I get no sense that people are thinking about this. DEFRA are talking about lowland peat. And from a biodiversity point of view, the nature recovery point of view, these sites are incredibly important and doing the right thing on them and raising the profiles. And this is a kind of in between. Havenhead Moss, Northumberland. It's one of the border mires, best peatland complex in England. This is about 230, 40 metres. So you kind of get this bit in the middle as well. And people get very confused about this. So that's my view on what peat are. So what do we mean when we say upland? do we need above 250 metres? A lot of the priority habitats we have, upland, grassland, uplands, lowland raised bog, upland heath. 250 metres line of enclosure is generally the description. What happens at that? Something magical happen? It's all different about that. Just the ecology change, just the hydrology change, which I discuss. Abiotic. So are the rocks different? Maybe. Is the ecology different? And I suppose the point is that a lot of the way we approach the world is kind of gained through personal and group experience and received thinking. And quite often, if you think about it a bit, why do we do that? So this is not a new debate. So Arthur Tansley, who was one of the most influential ecologists in the 20th century, who wrote the British Islands and Their Vegetation, which is a classic, and described the Britain's habitats probably for the first time clearly. There was a group of these ecologists who were very influential in the development of the science of ecology. And they'd obviously been looking at things and developing their thinking over the early 20th century. And I think for a long time, moor was used to describe any kind of big area of rough, heathery, stagnant vegetation. But they recognised that we shouldn't be calling it this, because actually within that you've got peatlands, you've got drier heathlands, you've got a whole range of different systems. And he stated in this book, the plant communities which form in the habitats, they used to be lowland and upland, but actually a much more useful and meaningful definition is to call them valley bog, raised bog, anaerobic bog, wherever they are, because of the means of their development and so. So, these things go in circles a bit, don't they? Anyway, read that. It's a brilliant piece of work. Does it matter? Actually, it can matter, because what we call things and the way we regard them, how they influences what we do with them, how we respond to them. So these are just some that I thought, maybe we could do a bit more in the workshops, but I think failing to recognise what you're looking at or dealing with can lead to various consequences, some significant, some maybe not significant. But if you don't recognise what you're dealing with, quite likely you'll do any management or restoration you try of it. Might not work, waste of money, not good. Worse than that, you can actually cause damage, which it happens. I've seen quite a few examples where some not through any sort of malicious intent. Somebody's thought, I'm going to restore this. They haven't really understood the system and actually not quite destroyed it, but quite severely damaged it. We also miss opportunities, because on some of these sites there are some quite uncommon habitats that maybe small parts of the system, we don't recognise those, we're missing a big opportunity for nature recovery. And something that I see commonly in my role is sites being misclassified, maybe because it's an upland site, so it must be this, or it's a lowland site, it must be that. And we've set inappropriate targets, which certainly for peatlands, I would say generally leads to setting much less demanding targets in terms of common standards monitoring. So we're calling sites favourable because we've completely misunderstood what they are, which it's not good for anyone. Politicians maybe say, yeah, we've got all these sites in very good condition, but they're not. So some examples of this. We've just got this we've done a review of the raised bog inventory for England. The raised bog inventory was based on some good data that Richard Johnson generated in the 80s and 90s, and then it's been through various iterations. And what we have on our sort of government map systems is now quite old, and because of work that we're doing recently, we found a lot more sites. But also, it was called lowland raised bog, and that was carried through to the UK VAT, so we get lowland raised bog. So immediately thinks, okay, right, so if it's above 200 metres, 250 metres, you can't have a raised bog. Well, of course you can. You know, raised bogs will form wherever the conditions that lead to their development. So a lot of raised bog sites, well, most raised bog sites that are over the underlying enclosure over 250 metres, if they're mapped at all, they're mapped as blanket bog. Which is, it's mapped as bog, so that's, part of the way there, but they're raised bogs. And they've got, their own specific conditions that are needed, and generally are much more diverse and support different species. So if you don't recognise them for what they are, you can't protect them, you can't manage them. So raised bog is endangered at a European scale. Really, it's on every list of sort of red list of habitats, and really massively declined. But actually, we have got more than we thought we had. As I described, I mean, we've had issues, particularly in Northumberland, where we've been calling really good raised bog sites blanket bog. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with common standards monitoring, but the blanket bog condition assessment is far less onerous and requires far fewer species to be present, and just generally conditions to be different than raised bogs. So, we've been saying sites and they needed a lot of work on them to sort them out, which we weren't doing because they said, oh, they're favourable, because they've got 6 indicator species. And the final point, we've got several examples where people have approached raised bogs with blanket bog restoration techniques which don't work, they don't take everything into account that you need to take into account. And they haven't worked, and sometimes they're damaging. So, I think that's quite a good example of where it is the issue. I'll go for it. Great. This is another similar one. Now 21, which I don't know how many of you are familiar with the MVC. This is a community of generally groundwater fed valley mire systems. They are, as Tansley described, you described them as valley bogs. They are sphagnum, dwarf shrub, sedge dominated communities. So they look very similar to other bogs, but they have got more of a groundwater influence. The MVC said, this is a lowland community. No, it's not a lowland community. It's just that all the recording for the MVC that found these was in the lowlands. They didn't look at upland sites. Higher altitude sites. And there's a lot of this in Cumbria, and again in the borders, and in Scotland, and in Wales. But because it's perceived as a lowland thing, people don't recognise it in the uplands, and so it's not, we don't manage it, we don't restore it. And again, it's kind of accepting this, we think that, scientists have worked it all out. We haven't. There's still lots to find out, and we need to look much more deeply at science and understand them. And it happens with species as well. There's a big issue in this country thinking, oh, that's an upland species, that's a lowland species. I think it's slightly obscure, but I'm going to get some pictures of some nice moss in. Tonanticum nitens is a bryophyte of base-rich fens. It forms quite a large component of peat deposits in places like the Broads and elsewhere in lower altitude sites. It's completely lost from most of the lowlands now. There's one record for East Anglia where it used to be common. It's regarded as an upland species. But it's only in the uplands because that's the only place now that isn't drained or nutrient enriched or wet. Same for Haematocornis vermicosus, which is green feather moss, grows in Obviously it grows in the kind of edges of bogs where you've got a bit of alkaline flushing maybe. Again, used to occur, not commonly, but throughout the lowlands. But now, suddenly in the uplands, because you haven't got the conditions. And it's the same with things like cross-pollinating, which used to be, you know, in most counties in England, but now is almost completely extinct in the lowlands. You only get it in the north, where it's low nutrient, not drained. You know, so the uplands become synonymous with certain conditions, which also used to occur in the lowlands. And it's that kind of understanding that we need to have. So, and some more wise words from Hans Houston, who's a European peatland expert, you'll be aware of him. He recently wrote the Global Guidelines for Peatland Rewetting and Restoration. This is a really good reference. What he wrote, whereas every peatland is unique, peatlands worldwide share many characteristics. Too much emphasis on the unique character of tropical or other peatlands can result in the danger of ignoring global knowledge and common sense. So I think there are two things there for me. First of all, every peatland is unique because the conditions in which every peatland developed are different. But there are kind of underlying principles around peatland development, like a saturated plant material that doesn't rot, and you know, it builds up in much the same way. So, looking more at the first bit, every peatland is unique. What we need to understand as restorers and nature recovery people, or wherever we are, and as carbon, I don't know, again, farming carbon or whatever you want to do, you need to understand how your peatland developed, and that's going to tell you pretty much what you need to do to restore it. And I think we do a bit of that. I see that, you know, there's a lot of places that we don't really investigate enough at the beginning of the process to understand how it developed and therefore what we really need to do to sort it out. That's just a couple of slides about how, you know, how we can do this and what we need to understand about systems. So this is probably familiar to you all. So understanding the water around peatlands is clearly the main thing that you need to do. Understanding why this place is wet and where the water's coming from, what the character of that water is, what the character of that water was when it developed. Is it the same now? Is it different? Have we lost groundwater in the inputs? Is the water enriched in what it was? And if so, what are you going to do about that? Because that's all part of the restoration of the system, of the ecosystem, which this is all about. This is something we use a lot to help us understand wetlands, the wetland framework. For impact assessments, it's got a bit of a clunky title, but it's a fantastic piece of work which kind of goes through how to understand wetlands from a bottom-up approach and being able to kind of look at each of these attributes of wetlands. So what landscape type is it in, what base richness, what's the base richness, what's the fertility of the system. And then there's this wet thing, which is the water supply mechanism. The report identifies 20 of those, and that can be sort of broken into fewer aggregated, fewer groups. But it's kind of, you know, is it permanent seepage? Is it purely rain-fed? Is it a percolation mire? It's all available online. I mean, how many people are aware of this and use it? Hands up. Put your hands up higher, I can't see. Yeah, okay, so probably less than half. This, and then the management bit, it's a really good tool just to help you contextualise wetlands and understand what's going on with them. This is just an example of the kind of product you can get from using that approach, which I certainly ask for in any contract I let out for anybody who's looking at sort of hydrology wetlands to support a restoration plan. you know, you come up, this is a wet mech 18, it's a percolation trough. You've got groundwater and rainwater coming into the site, and it kind of percolates through the peat deposit and then kind of flows down gradient. And so, you know, once you understand that, and you understand that the water's coming out of groundwater, a groundwater aquifer, and I don't know, maybe there's a bit of abstraction, so that's been reduced, maybe there's a big, that central flow track which goes through, which is actually a different water supply mechanism than lighting, maybe that's been deepened, because that's what people do, isn't it? Deepen any kind of natural flow track to drain it. You know, it gives you, okay, what do we need to do? What components of the system do we need to restore to sort it out? And this is just, I think I only want to go after this. Been doing a lot of work on peat probing as well, and peat depth to help understand how sites have developed. I'm doing it right across peat body, not just kind of in the middle. This is a site in Border Mires, Grainheads Moss. It's, you know, what you call it, again, this is one of those mid-altitude sites. You've got 9 mid, so you've got this series of ridges that kind of go trend east-west. And you get really deep peat in each of them. So you've got 9 metres of peat in that top one, and you've got shallow peats developed to kind of link up with the one below, and then it's grown over that ridge. Absolutely brilliant mire system. But without kind of knowing all that underlying topography, and also having looked at pH and stuff around in the site and around the edges, it's quite difficult to understand what you would do with that site and how it's developed and how it's functioning and how you need to restore. And this is in desperate need of restoration because it's a spruce all over most of it for about 50 years, been very heavily drained. So you know, we need to understand the real nuts and bolts of how this develops and where the water's coming from. Right, here we go. This is the last one. So I mean, kind of leading on to then the basis for restoration of peatland. Yeah, I would start from the point that for peatlands we're looking at restoration of natural function throughout the whole peat body and its catchment. It's much harder to do in some places than others. Quite tricky in the fens, for instance. But you know, that's where we should be starting from, and that's what our ambition should be for any peatland restoration. But in order to do that, you need to understand how the site developed and what it was in an undamaged state. And yeah, you need to look at stratigraphy, where the water's coming from. Historic plant records can be real, and biological records can be really useful in kind of pointing to what the conditions were. And also looking at any similar local undamaged sites. Right. So think about the landscape situation, hydrological inputs, particularly site modifications and pressures, and that's not just recent, because you need to get rid of all of those. Are there any immovable constraints? Because if there are, if they're genuinely immovable, you need to start thinking about how you mitigate those and what is feasible. But finally, the main point is, know your peatland. Don't let where it is blind you to what it is. If that makes sense. So, any questions? What do you think? Emma?
Firstly, a comment to say that Ian's touched on the wet mechs that are already available for learning systems. We are working, aren't we, Ian, on some of the blanket bob, and we're looking to do some webinars in the winter, early next year, to kind of explain the thinking behind that and how we kind of start to use them. Second, but the actual question is, have a large part of the Border Mires been reclassified to raised bog?
Yeah.
Is that official?
Yeah, it's on the internet. It is. Yeah, and that makes a massive difference because, we're working very, I don't really know Keeling Mires, Border Mires, they're owned largely by Forestry England, and it's the biggest plantation in England, and they say it's the only profitable plantation. But unfortunately, it's planted all over what was, still is, the best mire system in India. It's just this enormous extent of deep peat and with shallow peat between them. We were calling it all blanket bog, when actually you can see from that last slide, you know, you've got 10 metres of peat in lots of places, which just makes bog, and it's all just kind of joined up. So it wasn't easy, but we kind of convinced that, look, we're changing this because we've been misclassifying it. So it changed our favourable conservation tables, and then suddenly, from Forestry England thinking they'd done everything they needed to do, oh goodness, we've got an enormous amount of restoration to do here. But by reclassifying it, we're going to get an enormous amount of restoration of some amazing sites now, which wouldn't have happened if we carried on calling it blanket bog, possibly. Well, it certainly helped by kind of saying, look, well, you know, having 6 indicated species and a little bit of sphagnum is not what we want here, because these sites have still got sphagnum or stimuli on them. And you know, all sorts of stuff like pewflower sedge, bog sedge, which is just gone from the rest of the country. So yes.
So Ian, are they going to take the trees off?
They are taking trees off.
Okay.
They've just applied for a. Have they got a discovery grant?
They've finished their discovery grant. They've not come into restoration grant. They're going for environment,
landscape
recovery, and some
stuff. But yeah, it's going to drive quite a lot of tree removal, which for them is a big issue. You know, it's thousands of hectares potentially.
Are they best wooden?
No, it's very poor quality, isn't it?
Quite a lot of it's not great, is it? I mean, you see some of the plantation on the deep, you know, you've still got sphagnum magellanum and Andromeda growing underneath some of it.
It doesn't address the slopes that feed down into the mines though, and a lot of those
Well,
peat.
We've done some work with them on that as well, and they should, certainly triple size, they should be clearing all those, they shouldn't be replanting. They have been doing up to now, but yeah, well, be interested to know what you know.
Any other questions?
So on at the back there.
So you've reclassified those bogs in Cumbria. Where are you in terms of reclassifying the rest of the bogs in Cumbria?
Well, most of those are Northumberland, but in Cumbria.
Just in the country in general, I mean, I work in the Peat district, which I assume to be largely blanket bog.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Not doing
There are some raised bog. I found a raised bog near Castleton, but in terms of condition, you mean, or in terms of what we're calling?
Well, you're talking, the discussion has already been that if we're calling them upland, lowland, we're not defining them correctly. And we need to reclassify, and I think that has to be led by yourselves. So where are you in terms of reclassifying things that you think are not correctly classified?
For the raised bogs, I think we're doing okay. I think for most of the Peat district I don't think we'd be reclassifying that as blanket bog, unless we've got, there's a few sites, like maybe Ringing Low, or a couple of others, but most of it will not be reclassified because we don't think it's blanket.
So are there other areas in the country that you're doing to reclassify?
There are some other places, yeah. I mean, we need to look at the inventory and then go and talk to area teams and say, you know, well, we think, you know, and particularly where you've got M18, which occurs within blanket bog complexes, we need to say, look, well, you know, the blanket mire assessment as it is not addressing the needs of these parts of the blanket peat, if we're going to call it blanket peat.
And I'm going to ask the timescale question because as a practitioner, we're always held to very short timescales, 1 or 2 year funding. If this is going to take you 10 years, then I'm going to get 2 years of funding at some point to do the right thing. In between times, I'm going to end up doing the wrong thing because the classification takes so long.
I don't think it's not going to have that kind of implication. And I thought that the restoration that I think that quite a lot is going on is going to kind of lead to some of these conditions developing anyway. I'm not sure we're really doing anything different. And I wasn't suggesting that a lot of the work that's going on is not appropriate. In one or two places it is, but in most places what's being done will benefit any of these areas that we're maybe picking up now. So I don't think it's a significant issue for peat partnerships or the restoration work that's going on. But I suppose there's maybe an issue of kind of recognising where you may have sort of slightly different situations where something might need to be a slightly different technique, or just recognise that it's the wet bit and you're going to get an 18 now. And we need to be much more switched on to say, not just assessing it as a bit of M19 when you should have a lot more so in medium or something like that. Does that make sense?
And I think as well, if there are places in your areas where you're looking at it, you go, I think that's wrong. Just
Tell
us.
Yeah.
You know, obviously different area teams, different conversations, but Ian will always listen to you.
Because if you're out doing that work, you'll know better than we will what the conditions are like, and what you think is achievable or restorable.
What sort of scale would you change it? Because I've been on a few of the ones in Cumbria that you put the picture on. But how big, when do you classify it as a mire or colony? And is it just where how the water feeds in the bird, or a combination of both?
Well, it would be
what scale? Because I'm sure that on any of there's size, there's areas that could be this.
Well, I mean, that's where it becomes more difficult, isn't it? Where you've got predominantly kind of shallow hill with little domes within it, we need to know where they are, but whether you reclassify it's a kind of new point, really. I think for some of these, they're really big raised domes, and you've got to recognise them as that. But where you've got maybe smaller features within a much bigger expanse, there's always going to be a grey area, and I think, what do you call that? Because it's kind of a bit of both. But it's recognising them and doing the right thing. That's the most important thing. I suppose what you call them, it doesn't really matter as long as you do the right thing.
Is there any more questions? We're going to have lots more time for discussion, and Ian will be mooching around so you can quizzing him.
These are my views. I mean, they're not necessarily endorsed by everybody in natural Olympics.
Is that in writing?
Did you explain with
it's recorded on the video, Ian, so is there anything else at the moment? If not, I'll move us on to...
Do you want me to leave any slides up or anything, or should I just switch this down?
Just leave it for the moment, people might want to refer back to it later on.
Yeah, we can move back to it. So, thanks Ian, that was excellent. Good discussion starters. What we've got now, we've got about an hour left. So we've kind of come up with 5 broad topics that we think would be good to discuss, which I'll run through in a second. What we're going to do is split into 5 groups, sort of small groups, so you can have a bit more in-depth discussion on these topics. There'll be some flip chart paper, so you can scribble stuff down that you've discussed, and we'll have about 10-15 minutes on 3 different topics, if that makes sense. So we'll move you around, and then at the end we'll have about 15 minutes to come back together and sort of discuss any important points that people have come up with and raised. So the topics we have got, I can read Chris's terrible handwriting. That's right. The first one is kind of application of techniques, so restoration techniques, monitoring techniques, all that kind of range of stuff on the ground, and just we're putting these as starting points. Obviously, go off on whatever tangents feel useful to discuss, but we're thinking about here what techniques are sort of traditionally seen as lowland or upland, and do we think that's useful? Is there actually examples where someone's gone, actually, well, that was a lowland technique, but I've used it on the top of a hill and it worked really well? That kind of thing. And then second is, what does good look like in terms of what restoration or the kind of outcomes you're looking for? What does good look like, and is there has there become some dichotomy with that? Third up, the aims of restoration. So are we looking at full-on restoration to the original habitat? Are we looking at something, you know, a bit more halfway house? What's been achieved in different scenarios? What kind of discussions being had? And also thinking about the additional benefits, say like wildfires, floods, biodiversity, all that kind of additionality that comes into peat restoration. And yeah, is there some that are more focused in upland, so-called upland, lowland areas? How can that come together? Fourth, we've got attitude to risk. So thinking about innovation, technology, what's people's experiences in different areas of, are we willing to try stuff? Are we more willing to just sort of go, no, it's too risky, we're going to do nothing, that kind of thing, if that makes sense. And then third is historic environment, approaches to that, what kind of issues there are, what kind of mitigations being put in place, all that kind of stuff. Does that make sense? Any topics that don't make sense or you think are totally pointless?
We'll be around to sort of hop around and answer questions.
Yeah, we'll drop in and join in the discussions as well. So yeah, just as to reiterate what Chris said at the beginning, this is not a right or wrong. What Ian said, you can totally disagree with all if you want. He won't take it too personally. You know, we just want to get discussions going, get people's honest thoughts and experiences together. And if you can sort of assign a scribe or someone to write on a piece of paper, and then the next group that comes around can see what you've written and add stuff or, you know, comment on it, whatever. And then the last one you get to, if you can kind of have a bit of an idea of everything that's written down and one person can kind of be ready to just give a quick summary back to the room at the end, that would be great.
Did everyone get the hang of what they were doing there? Good.
Can't ask that now, Chris.
I just did.
What if the answer's no? No, it's good, yeah, good discussions from what I was listening into, which is nice to hear. I think we'll just crack on and the others can slot in. Who's got the techniques? Topic number one. That's you. All right, you and mine. Just giving you've got a 3-minute summary.
That would be very kind of you, thank you. So we came to this last, so these are mainly other people's ideas, not mine. Okay. So there is some crossover between upland and lowland techniques. They're predominantly drain blocking, bunding, reprofiling. The sphagnum we debated a little bit because I learned a bit about neotrophic versus homotrophic yesterday, because I asked the question about how peat forms in the fenlands, because I wasn't seeing sphagnum and nobody was talking about sphagnum, but sphagnum is basically all we ever talk about in the uplands. And that's because sphagnum isn't the primary function of forming peat. It's just I've forgotten the word again already. The lack of oxygen under the water.
Anaerobic.
Thank you. Where it forms the peat that way by just subsuming primarily reeds in the silt of the fens rather than by the sphagnum causing the right conditions. So we have a few different techniques that we're using at the site. So there's the hag reprofiling primarily in the uplands because we get lots of hags, don't seem to have very many here because it's pretty flat. Erosion control and water, I'm sorry I can't read that.
Whose word is that?
Energy.
Water, energy.
So I guess that's about the water flows in the uplands versus the lowlands where it flows along rather than down. And we were talking about a site where they were trying to reintroduce sphagnum on bare peat in the lowlands and not having a great deal of success, primarily due to wind erosion. So there was perhaps some techniques from the uplands that were used for revegetating bare peat that could be translated to the lowlands, such as brash seeding or geotextiles, to give that protective layer while things establish. Techniques from the lowlands, contour bunding and water management, and there's quite a lot of use of plastic we still see down in the lowlands, so plastic piling for blocking ditches, but also I've heard other people talking from their site visits of plastic sheeting being inserted into ditches to provide a permanent barrier for the peat to control water that way. There are different access constraints. In the uplands we require a lot of helicopter time to move stuff around on the hills because it's the only way we can get it there. Not necessarily a thing here.
but you've got a lot of drains to cross here, so it gives you a different problem. And they're using, the drains are used to keep land wet as well as to drain it. It's a water management system rather than solely a draining system that we have in the uplands. And the sort of final point on here was the scale of application that we use in the uplands tends to be much larger in scale, in area. But the scale of collaboration we found down here from talking to people seems to be much bigger than the scale of collaboration that we have to have in the uplands because of the effects on the neighbours. We've got so many more stakeholders in the lowlands, there's so much more land in interest, and any of the techniques that are applied seem to have a much wider effect across the thing, i.e. if you block a ditch on this field, 10 fields over it gets flooded. So there's much more of that, much more stakeholders. So I'm hopeful that that's a reasonable summary of what's on the sheet.
Thank you.
Thank you. Number 2. What does good look like? Which group finished on that? That's someone want to summarise what we were talking about? I can be the poster.
Human flip chart.
I'll be the human flip chart.
There's quite a lot on this. We
Yeah,
have
a 3-minute summary.
Discussions about this, and lots and lots of different points, lots of things in common, and then as we start to talk about it in more detail, how they pulled apart as well. So does good look like having the water table at a stable level, and that would produce the indicator species and the habitat, etc. that you'd want. Biodiversity, and then what does that look like? And that would be different depending on where you were. Land management, again, we talked about sustainable land management, and then it would be different depending on where you were. Valued by people and the community, understanding it, and the community engaged as well, and that seems to be a bit of a common thread. Water quality, so nutrient levels and sediment. And then we started talking about the differences in terms of pluviculture versus semi-natural habitat as well, or restoring to more natural habitat. Catchment management and somebody else's comment, just catchment management. Sustainable approaches, so being able to sort of sustainable into the future, and what will it look like in the future, and then resilience, and when is it enough, when do you stop, what's perfect, and the 80% rule, I guess. And carbon emissions and retention in the soil, so preventing degradation, maybe aiming for sequestration, maybe that's the indicator of what good looks like. And down at the bottom, is a little bit talking about how you go about it in the different areas in terms of cultivation versus that more natural habitat again. So I think that's pretty much what we were talking about. So lots of common threads, but then when you start to get into detail, it starts to get a bit further apart as the common gist of our conversation.
Great. Thanks, Emma. Number 3.
Yeah, should I give you that?
John, I will continue my...
No derail, Johnny, will it?
Maybe there's no point coming. Interestingly, when we were talking about the sheet that Emma was just summarising, we sort of moved on to this before we even moved on to the table. So maybe that shows that what good looks like should include additional benefits as well. So of course there's climate and carbon sequestration, and that of course might be the primary reason that the area is being restored, in which case it's not an additional benefit. But then you move into things like biodiversity, or if it's being restored for biodiversity, then carbon might be an additional benefit. And of course the benefits it gives to all the species that inhabit this area. Something we really moved on to and we're talking about was access as well. So by restoring an area, you get money to work on an area. One of the sites that's been worked on in Cumbria was suffering heavy erosion from footfall between two wainwrights. And that was actually, that was the main cause of the erosion. So there was money incorporated into the grant to build a footpath between the two. So that's not only restored the area, but it's also provided a much nicer walking experience for people using that environment for recreation. So improved access to the land. That may differ between upland and lowland due to historical access rights, rights to roam, things like that. We also talked a lot about engagement and education. So through the restoration of an area, whether it's built into the grant or subsequent to the initial grant, getting groups out into the area and seeing what an amazing landscape it is. We had a talk yesterday at Flag Fen by, I think her name might be Sue, I can't remember, she was working with schools and working to get groups out into the fenland, primarily to look at the historical features, but of course you could build in the environmental features as well. And then we looked in that education, we sort of followed that thread on to also with landowners and commoners and upskilling them and educating them about what's going on in the area they work. Perhaps opening up opportunities for access to grants for them personally, so maybe a slight diversification in their business of their farm. There was quite a lot on there. That's a bit of a summary.
Great. Thank you very much. Who's got number 4?
I do. I'll sit here if that's okay.
I suppose we'll allow it.
Number 4 was attitudes to risk with practice, innovation versus doing nothing. We had quite a lot of discussion, as did other people, around the desire to be innovative, but blocked perhaps by consenting processes, Natural England or otherwise, whether that's Natural England's fault. Not 100% convinced. But we talked about, obviously on a protected site, you need a robust evidence base in order to be able to consent something. Natural England can't consent to something by and large. Without that, you just open yourself up to judicial review and your decisions being overturned, and that's happened before, particularly in the uplands, which I think is possibly why it's more, one of the reasons why that threshold is higher in the uplands, because there's been a higher political interest and review of previous decisions. So we looked at that evidence threshold and whether or not it was set too high, and whether more things could be done, more trials could be run, and evidence gathered to share that knowledge and to build that evidence base to show that maybe these novel techniques aren't so novel anymore. There was a good discussion around, as a restoration community, perhaps we're good at sharing things that have gone well, but perhaps not as good at sharing things that haven't worked so well. So we've got an evidence base of a few things that have worked, not necessarily the stuff that hasn't worked. And also, just we did talk about sort of how that evidence is collated and whose role it is to bring all this knowledge sharing together. The next thing, there was a point about the lowlands with a higher risk of disappearing from the high degradation rate, fighting against a history of drainage, perhaps leading to more innovation than in upland sites. And I think that's probably true, because I was picturing, for example, let's say a site that's had peat extraction, so it's miles and miles of milled peat. There's an urgency to deal with that you maybe don't have in an upland site, and maybe that leads to more innovation. The uplands, we had the comment that there was perhaps more of a textbook approach to restoration, but that doesn't necessarily lead itself to dealing with the pressures that each unique site has. So when you do have this more of a textbook approach, it doesn't work so well when you need to be adaptable, when the prescription that we have for carrying out a particular restoration technique doesn't work, and it's not always easy to get that change. There were some comments about resistance to change from traditional management, and that's probably true for uplands and lowlands. Landowners' opinions and views. So they can also depend on possible effects such as costs and opportunities. And that's, there is, I guess, a bit of an upland-lowland divide there. Like one of the things that we had on the very first day, when they were talking about the bins results, and he was talking about that sort of £3,000–4,000 incentive for payments for results, making a huge difference to upland farmers. They would just laugh at it down here. So that can maybe drive change and innovation.
30 seconds.
Okay, but there was a big comment about fire risk, which we didn't really touch on. But it says fire service recommends burning to prevent wildfire. They don't necessarily. In fact, the fire service would recommend sort of targeted fire breaks and fuel breaks. But in the uplands, the burning that you normally see isn't recommended by the fire service, and there's no evidence that general fuel load production through burning leads to greater wildfire resilience. It leads to sites drying out and increased heather dominance. And I would say to prevent wildfire, you need to be sorting out hydrology first.
Yeah. That's what the discussion was around.
Okay.
On the paper, but it was some people have had recommendations from the fire service that to reduce the fire risk you need to keep burning. So that was where that conversation would come from. Great. Number 5, last but not least.
Yeah, I'll be quite quick. It's historic environment, so comments about large-scale blanket bog having lots of space and therefore historic features being less of a constraint than in lowlands where they're potentially more densely populated. The attitudes and assumptions has been that re-wetting equals positive for historic features, but there's a comment here, and we found it as well, that re-wetting potentially damages stuff in the lowlands and also removes the access. So the water's gone down, there's now access to record these historic features, but if we're suggesting raise the levels again, then that will remove that access. So that's constrained to basically record everything while it's available to be recorded. And then, potentially archaeology could be a hook for engagement activities with potential learning points in the uplands and blanket bog settings. And then there's sort of are some features actually historic features, and some people feel frustrated. For example, historic cutting, even though it's cutting from the 1900s, is now a constraint which we have to work around. So I think it's generally just more clarity on why we need to preserve these, and when it's just a watching brief it's needed, or when it's actually like an exclusion zone, and that probably applies to uplands and lowlands. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
It's been really good. Just really quickly before you all disappear for lunch, do just like a little raise of hands. Alright, so either do we have more in common, uplands and lowlands, or actually are they really different? More in common than we thought. Chris is going now. This is an official. You've got to pick. You should have done it before and after.
9, 10, 11, 12, 13.
Or actually they're really very different and we need to keep treating them really differently.
It depends on the definition of lowland.
Yeah.
Are we talking the span, or are we talking
anything? Both, all of it. That's it, isn't it? Well, that was like a few half hands.
Yeah, it
Is the upland-lowland distinction useful? Yes or no? Hands up if the upland-lowland distinction is a useful one. Hands up for yes.
In some contexts.
Okay.
I work at 9 hands a week, that's quite 50 meters.
I think Scotland's a bit different because you do.
No more discussion.